Hi, I'm Jennifer Sir. Welcome to the Sewing Room and our Jobs in Fashion series. Today, my guest is Susan Aplanalp-Weeks, who is a dear friend and colleague that I worked with at Gap many years ago. She's had a varied and interesting career on either ends of that experience, and I'm excited for her to be here today. Her current job is as a professional fashion instructor, teaching at UC Davis, Otis Parsons, and privately as well. We're digging in a little bit deeper today on how designers make their fashion happen. So listen close and let's get started. Welcome to the Sewing Room, Susan. Thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me, Jennifer.
I'm so excited to talk about fashion design and turning that into production, but also I want to hear a little bit about what you do and how you got to where you are now.
All right. Well, just sort of starting at the beginning, I studied at UC Davis in the design department. So I've always had that passion for design and fabric and fashion. And from there, I worked at different sort of stages in my life with a buying program with Macy's. And then what really got me into the direction of fashion design really in a solid way was when I started working as a pattern maker. And I was sort of trained on the job, but it had the basic skills from my education. And I did that for many years where I worked as a pattern maker for Karen Alexander, who was at a company called Shady Grove that she owned in Oakland. And we did everything because it was a small company. And that was from cutting the fabric out to picking the buttons for the garments, getting the garments ready for the shows, and pattern making. So that pattern making really got me the basic skills to really go to my next main job, which was a technical designer at Gap. And that is where
That's
we
really
met.
nice.
And a technical designer for a company like Gap is a little different than working for Karen Alexander. And we can talk more about that later. But then more about my journey. From there, I started doing a little guest lectures for UC Davis. They invited me to come and occasionally do guest lectures and eventually invited me to start teaching an illustration class for them. So this was while I was at Gap. And then at one point, I retired from Gap and my friend Karen Alexander, who I first started with, so full circle, was also retiring. And I bought her company, Karen Alexander, and also known as Shady Grove. Um, and then I started my own business with a small production in Emeryville. And my company name was Emery Street because that's where we were located. And so I did production for Chico's, for Boston Proper. And that is really where my main design production experience came from. And just to sort of finish off the journey where I am now, I started teaching more and more. And at one point decided that teaching was really where at that stage in my life I needed to be. And I switched over to teaching full time, which coincided with the building where my studio was getting sold. So everything happens for a reason. And as I look back through my journey, that's where I am now, which is mainly teaching.
Mainly teaching.
Mainly teaching.
And mainly teaching at Davis.
Mainly teaching at Davis. There was several years where I was teaching at CCA. I've also taught at Otis, which remotely in Los Angeles. And so teaching is really something that I feel like settles into where I am in my life right now very nicely. So,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Um, for designers just starting out, what do they know? What do they need to know to get started?
So when you're thinking about a career in design, one of the things that I like to recommend to people is to really think about what it is that you want to design and do a little practice run for yourself. And what I like to do is I have an Etsy site and I'll make whatever it is that I'm thinking I want to make this on a bigger scale. And I'll make some for my Etsy site and see what the response is. And so do a little test market for yourself. Um, but also, as a designer, it's more about what is your goal? Is your goal to be someone who does big production, one of a kind? So really research, I would say, what is it? What kind of a designer are you really thinking about? And then that would determine your next steps.
Right. And it also, do you want to be a designer for yourself or do you want to be a designer for somebody else? Because that's also an option.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And sometimes starting off working for somebody else is the best way to sort of learn.
Right.
And I think that I would definitely recommend doing that. And sometimes people have that passion inside where they just really feel like I just want to design my own thing and do my own thing. But it is a good idea to really work with somebody else and see how they do it and then get some ideas for yourself when you're ready to take that big step.
Absolutely. What's the difference between sample sewing and production sewing?
Sample sewing and production sewing. So again, depending on if you're in a small company or a big company, that can be a very different thing. So for example, with Carrie and Alexander, which was a smaller company, the sample sewing was something that we did in house. And there were sample sewers that were right there with the pattern makers and the designers. And they would sew up a sample. And then we would try it on in the fitting room on a fit model. And when it was perfect, then we would go into our production samples. So that what that means is all the little kinks had been worked out. A new pattern maker who was the production pattern maker who was responsible for making that pattern and that sample perfect so that when it went into production, um, you can make, let's say, 200 of them. And if there was any little tiny mistake, it wouldn't be made 200 times. And then for a bigger company like the Gap, the samples are made probably overseas somewhere, but they are still then brought back into the house to do that fitting. And the production or the tech designer would make sure that tech pack and the production patterns were perfect so they wouldn't be multiplied 10,000 times. So that production sample and production pattern is very different from the developmental sample.
Right.
Whereas first we're creating and just trying to figure it out with the design, but then once it goes into production, we're really making sure everything's perfect so that it
Right.
can be made 100 or 1,000 times.
And on a micro business scale,
Mhm.
you might be having a sample maker create your production because it's only a couple pieces of each.
You
Right.
could, yeah, depending on what scale that you're working, um, you probably will have still, if it's a very, very, very small scale, you may have one person doing all of that for you. For example, a medium size may have a local sample house instead of sending it across to India or China or Indonesia to make thousands of them. But within that sample house, there is still probably someone who's sewing the developmental samples and someone else who's sewing production, because it's two different skill levels. The person
Oh,
who's making the samples, the original samples, may be someone who sews much quicker, but maybe does not have the finesse of someone who's sewing that production quality and making sure that every single thing is perfect, 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 because it goes a little slower. The samples need to be, those original samples need to be sewn very quickly because there's the time crunch of meeting deadlines.
Right.
So there's a little bit of a difference between the sample pattern maker and the sample sewer, who usually works as a team, and the production pattern maker and the production sewing, which is also another team.
right. And then
Yeah.
in production sewing, um, are the production sewers usually doing like only a certain task, or are they completing the entire garment themselves?
Usually it is a task. So when we say a task, it could be, if it's a big production, it's in a sewing line. So the production sewers are in lines of, when I worked for Old Navy, we went to the factory in Mexico where they were sewing denim for jeans. One person would only sew the waistbands. They were at a special machine that would sew that waistband. And then another person would only sew the inseams. They would have another machine. So instead of one person changing the settings on one machine and then sewing the whole thing, which would be a sample maker, you would have a production line where step one would be one thing, and then they hand it off to the next person. And step two would be another thing, like all the backs would be sewn, and then the person would sew the pockets on. That would be with a pocket setter. So every step has its own machine in a big production. In a smaller production, maybe someone would do the body, someone else would do the sleeve and cuffs. So they would set it up, and all the threads would be set up a certain way. And so it is, they do call it a production line, even if it's just two
Interesting,
or three people or
Yeah.
100, we don't know.
Right. Right. How many fittings does it usually take before a garment goes into production?
Ooh, that's a good question. And that is one that a lot of people really think about very carefully, because you want as few fittings as possible, because every fitting and every sample costs money. So if you do your first sample and it's perfect, you just saved a lot of money, because now you don't have to correct it with that pattern maker, resew another sample with that sample maker, and then fit it again with the fit model. So those are three expensive things. So you really want to limit the number, but I would say at least one for a big production, and sometimes just one fitting for that, the first fitting, and you don't even have to make another sample if it's a smaller production. That is really the goal. And I think that someone smaller, I'll use Leslie Evers, for example, they really try to get that first sample perfect. And then if there's a little tweak, they'll do that. But they do have a lot of bodies that are made off of the same garment. So if they have a skirt that really sells really well, they'll make a new skirt, but they'll use that old pattern, and then the new fabric just needs a slight little tweak.
A little adjustment.
Yeah.
Exactly. Do most companies have a set of blocks that they use?
Yeah, so they're those basic, we could call them blocks or starting points. And those are the best sellers.
Right.
They're best things they know that are tried and true. They have their history of sales. And so that's when it comes down to the money part, where you're constantly looking at your sales, looking at what sells, looking at what never sold at all. Don't use that pattern ever again, or that idea, right? But the things that really sell are like gold. You want to just keep using them. I made a dress for Leslie Evers, and I was looking back, and I think it was in 2014, and I just saw that same dress She's still using it. It's like a great fitting dress, and she has beautiful prints that she designs and she
Mhm.
puts them into her new prints. And so if you have something that fits and sells,
Yeah, why
just
not?
keep going with it. You don't have to, you need to adjust for fabrics and here and there, but yeah.
How important is the tech pack or spec sheet um, in the production process?
So that's something that is very important. And so that we were talking about the sample maker and the production sewer, there's the same sort of situation where the person who's making that initial pattern needs to make a tech pack
Mhm.
as clearly as possible with as much information that they can. And that is going to be different than the production, because then the handoff to production needs to be as cleanly as possible. Everything is perfect, but then that production tech designer or pattern maker or team need to make sure that the weight of the thread, what size zipper teeth are all the fabrics in there, everything that relates to that garment is very important, because that tech pack then could go to two countries or two factories in the
Right.
same city, but the end result needs to be exactly the same.
Exactly the same. So they need to have a sketch, they need to have
That's right.
measurements, all the graded measurements for all
Mhm.
the sizes, right? And then
Right.
along with the bill of materials and any construction notes,
Mhm.
right?
Any information that they can give that will make that garment perfect. And I remember at Gap, some of those denim tech packs were 50 pages long.
I remember that.
You remember
Oh
those?
my God, yes.
Because it was the
Yes.
grommet and how far away the grommet was from the edge, and how many stitches are there per inch,
Mhm.
and what color is the thread, because maybe there was different colors of threads for the different garments. Where are the bar tacks on the zipper? So every
Right.
little thing, because they would use that tech pack to make thousands and probably 10,000, up to
Right.
10,000. And if there was one thing wrong, if that grommet was in the wrong place, it could cost millions of dollars
Right.
in markdown. So it's a lot of
Mhm.
pressure, but it doesn't mean that, you can't get it perfect, and you had to get it perfect. So
No, I was just watching Making the Cut, and we were just talking
making the
about that
cut,
show. um,
watch Make the Cut if you want to start your own business.
and they have to make these check packs for their sewers.
Yeah,
And yet you can see in that show how important it is, because if
yeah,
they don't get the tech pack right, sometimes their
yeah.
garment doesn't come back sewn at
Yeah,
all,
they're
right?
all surprised, like,
Yeah.
oh, they didn't put the facing on. What oh, I forgot to write it down.
Right.
Or, why did they do this? Because you wrote it down that way. So it is so important. And I think that in that show, and I highly recommend anybody who is thinking about starting their own business, watch that show. Because a lot of those people have started their own business and they need that money to go to the next level. Um, they don't know how to make that tech pack
Mhm.
properly.
Right.
And some of them, I don't think lately there's been people that don't know how to sew, but there was one, I think maybe the
Right.
first one, where they didn't know how to sew. And I think now they figured out we have to find people who
You actually know how
do
to
know how
sew.
to
Yeah.
sew, because have to know how to sew, make patterns, all that stuff you do need to
You
know
need
how
to
to do if
know.
you
Yep.
want your own company, for sure.
So how do designers find manufacturers and or sample makers?
That is the golden ticket, and that is the key to being either successful or not successful. And I feel that when I look at successful designers, I know that they have a successful team, because
Mm,
no designer is going to be successful unless they have a really good team. And so it's like anything else, that finding that good team is going to be the key. And there are, especially in the Los Angeles area, but some here too, there are, I guess, published um, people who have companies that are available. And one of the things that is important to know is that when you do start working with somebody, that the smaller your production is, the higher the prices are. And the bigger your production is, the lower the prices are, because they do have to set up all those machines in the line.
Mhm.
And they don't want to do that for 20 pieces. They'll charge sample prices for that, which is much higher. I think it's 3 times higher. And so then you have to decide, where do I draw that line of, do I sew it myself? Which is goes back to, try something out on Etsy for yourself to see how it goes. Or do I pay those higher prices for something smaller until I can get to the next level? But finding them, I think, there are published um, places that have sewing shops, and then they basically will interview you. They want to make sure you have money.
Mhm.
And a lot of people really won't work with you unless they know you sort of have a reference.
Right.
And so that's where, someone like you or me come in.
Mhm.
And if it's someone that we know and trust, we can give them a reference for someone that would take them on, because I think, once you start working with the sample houses and with the production houses that are local, they have had so many people try to work with them that don't understand the industry.
Right.
They want to make sure first, before they start working with you, that you understand that this is going to cost a lot of money.
Right.
And that you need
Yeah.
to pay them half up front. In many cases, they want to have half of it up front
They want to have
before they even start. Yeah. And so that percentage changes with depending on who you're working
Mhm.
for.
What's the usual minimum amount of pieces that they'll accept for production?
So that will depend again on if you work with them for a while. And um, I know that the contractor that I work with really doesn't like to do anything under 100 pieces.
Now,
That's kind of the minimum.
right. So 100
Unless it's a
pieces of
sample.
one
Style.
style,
Of
maybe
one
in
style.
different sizes, but of one
Different
style.
sizes. It could be even maybe different colors. But yes, because that is for their cutting.
Mhm.
Because when they're cutting, they can cut different colors and they'll work the different sizes in. So that's that first stage. And then depending on the colors, they may use one color thread if it's similar. So they work everything out very carefully. And I think a lot of people get sticker shock when they hear the price, but you do have to realize that locally, if you're thinking locally, the minimum wages are 15, 16, up to, I mean, I don't know what Emeryville is right now, but they're creeping up towards $18 an hour.
Mhm.
So think about how long it takes you to cut and sew whatever it is you're looking at, and then times that by the minimum wage, and you'll see that that's usually a
Right.
pretty good price. They
Yeah.
don't, yeah, I think they're pretty fair about their prices.
Yeah, and you want to be able to pay people a living wage.
Yeah,
Right?
you don't want to work with anybody who is not paying them minimum wage, and you need to make sure that they have their garment certification registration.
Mhm.
So you'll want to see that. And what that means is they are paying minimum wage, because you can't have your license, just like a contractor's license who needs to build a house. You don't want to work with someone who doesn't have a
Mhm.
license. What that means is they're paying people minimum wage and they're working legally with the
Mhm.
state of California. So,
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know you had to get that license when
yeah,
you were working
yeah.
for Karen Alexander. So,
When I had employees, especially when I had employees and contractors that were directly working for me and not working for another employer. Yes, the EDD forms, your taxes. So it's really important to understand that running a business is expensive, And so you want to make sure that everything that you're doing is legal with the state of California, which means if you're even if you're making hats or belts or whatever it is that you're making, you need that garment registration certification. And if you're working with somebody, you want to make sure they have that too.
Right.
So,
And what if you're doing everything yourself? Do you need to have that garment certification?
um, that's a kind of a gray area.
Gray
And I think that with the cottage industry of Etsy, if you are hand making everything for yourself and selling it on a platform like Etsy, you're fine. But if you do look through the fine print, the state of California would prefer, but I don't think they're going to come raid your house and say, what are you doing?
Right.
But if you're in a shop and you are doing a regular steady production and you are hiring people, you personally are paying their salary, then you definitely need to have that.
That's
So,
good to know. Very
yeah,
good to know.
yeah.
Well, Susan, thank you so much
Thank
for
you for
talking with us
having me.
today.
I'm really excited to hear about everything that your students are doing, and I love that you have this place here in Alameda and for the East Bay for designers, young designers, to really learn about the whole industry and how to
Right.
build their skills.
Yes, building skills is so important.
It
And
is. It is.
yeah, we're working on something really special right now. So I'm
Okay.
hoping to show our students the next level, like after they learn pattern
Mhm.
making and after they learn more about fashion
Yeah.
design and more about sewing, and they want to have their own lines, where
Hmm.
we're planning on helping them figure out how to
Yeah.
produce that and what to do, what it takes to
Yeah.
get that done.
Well, I'll be happy to help. So let me know.
And if anybody wants to work directly with you as an instructor online, how can they get a hold of you?
They can reach out to me. My email is on my website, emerystreet.com, and or they can reach out through you. But I am happy to talk to anybody about pattern making lessons or illustration or anything else for private lessons.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, thank you so much,
All right.
Susan.
Thanks, Jennifer.
You're welcome. To summarize what Susan and I talked about, the top few things that are important to know as a designer when you're starting out are to know what kind of designer you want to be. Number one, do you want to be the kind of designer who is a very small micro designer, or do you want to be a designer who produces lots of stuff and rules the world with their fashion design? Um, it's two different kinds of places to be, because some people want to do something on a micro scale and some people want to do it on a bigger scale. And also, maybe you just want to work as a designer for someone else. That's also a viable job. So to think about those things before you get started, because they're very different. They have a very different process to them. She also suggests that if you are trying to be a small designer, that maybe you do a little test run first and see how it goes, either with a pop-up shop or a little Etsy shop. It's a great way to get started. It's really important to think about working with somebody else when you're first starting out. When you're first starting out, you don't necessarily know what you need to know. So it's good to get a job with a design firm already that is making clothes and producing them. You'll make great contacts and you'll learn so much in the beginning. We also talked a little bit about production and sewing, and sample sewing, and what the differences between those two things are. So sample sewing is like your prototypes and making your ideas first come to life, and then with those samples you fit those to perfect them, and then once they're perfected they go onto a sewing line, which is the production line. So that's how your garments get made in production, where it's not one person making an entire garment. It might be one person doing one function on one part of the garment, and so on and so forth. But like we talked about in the video, that might depend just on what what level of production you're doing. You could be sewing it all yourself, which I don't recommend, But if you're doing it on a micro level, that might just be how you start out. You'll need to fit your samples on a fit model, just like I just said, and that's part of the process. You want to see what it looks like on a standard size body, whatever that is. Whether it's your standard size might be different from Joe Schmo's standard size, and it could be, but you want to fit it on a fit model first, and then also consider fitting it on a size range of different people once you get into your graded sizes. And then you'll want to make sure that you have a tech pack. The tech pack is super important. It is how you will communicate to those people helping you. It is an image of your garment, whether it's a photograph or a sketch. And usually a flat sketch is what you do. And then you make notes on it. And then you have all your measurements for all your different sizes, as well as everything else that goes into the garment and how you want it to be made. So the tech pack really is the way to show someone else how to make this garment. And when you're going to find production and sample sewers, having a good team is really key. So we'll get into that later on like actually how do I find them? Where do they exist? We'll get into that later. But for now, just remember having a team of people that you work with and a good team that you can rely on, super important. So that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this interview. It was full of a lot of meaty, juicy little tidbits that are maybe that don't seem so exciting, but they really are important when you're making clothing for other people. So I'm excited that you have made it this far in this video. If you want to like this video and subscribe, that really helps us out. Leave a comment below if you have any questions. I'm happy to answer them. And if you want to reach Susan, I will put her information in the show notes. So have a great day and happy sewing, everyone.